I had no choice but to pull into the Walmart parking lot on a Thursday night, which I typically avoided at all costs. I needed supplies to prepare for a team meeting the following day after my boss dropped a last-minute bombshell, so I couldn't just show up without them. He warned me last week. I looked at my phone to see the list of PR Inc. notepads and coffee pods that I had quickly typed up. It was easy enough, so I put the phone in my jacket pocket inside the parking lot. A group of teenagers were laughing loudly close to the entrance. Shopping carts were strewn haphazardly, and the flickering overhead light created long, eerie shadows on the cracked asphalt. A sharp wind ripped through my jacket, pushing me in the direction of the entrance, so I snuck inside. I grabbed a cart and headed for the office supplies aisle, where I was confronted by the familiar hum of fluorescent lights and the subtle smell of disinfection mingled with something less pleasant. Halfway through my list, I experienced a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you realize they're watching you. He was tall, bald, and obviously disheveled when I looked up and scanned the aisles. His white tank top was covered in what appeared to be grease, and his jeans were torn on one side, revealing ashy, scarred skin. However, it wasn't just his appearance that chilled me. It was his bloodshot eyes. I tried to shake it off, but they were staring at me with such intensity that I felt sick to my stomach. Perhaps he wasn't even looking at me. I made myself concentrate on the shelves and get the notepads I needed. When I looked up again, he was gone, and I felt a little wave of relief as I turned my cart. He was again, this time closer, and he was standing at the end of the aisle, half hidden behind a cleaning supply rack. His eyes had not faltered, and my heart rate had increased, so I left my cart and made the decision to go to the... When I arrived at the women's restroom, a yellow sign informed me that it was closed for business. The increasing soreness in my bladder had become unavoidable, and if I was going to face my misery, I needed to do so without being distracted by it. Upkeep excellent, I whispered to myself that my annoyance was fleeting, but when the same chill went up my spine, I carefully turned my head in the hopes that I was being overly suspicious. But the man was back. His face was partially hidden by the flickering light as he stood at the far end of the hallway leading to the restrooms, but his posture was unmistakable. His head tilted slightly as if he were studying me in desperation. I spotted another restroom near the back of the store and hurried toward it in the hopes of losing him in the maze of aisles. As I pulled open the heavy restroom door and slid inside, my footsteps reverberated in the deserted hallway. The quiet was so loud that I rushed into the closest stall and locked the door behind me. For a few while I leaned against the cold metal wall to attempt to regulate my breathing, and everything would be okay. The bathroom door creaked open, and I stopped as heavy footsteps bounced off the tiled floor slowly and deliberately. I went to my knees and peered under the stall, and the first thing I noticed were boots that were battered, scuffed, and caked. I convinced myself that he probably wasn't even following me. They approached, pausing just outside my stall with dirt, and when I saw his shadow, my breath caught. Someone is there, lurking beneath the gap. My voice was shakier than I had planned, and I got up to peek through his red-rimmed, foggy eye was pressed against the gap staring at me. I yelled, my voice echoing off the walls, "Leave me alone!" But he didn't move. Instead, a guttural groan rumbled from the space between the stall door and the frame. His voice was low and unhuman, and then he did something unexpected. He pounded, his head against the stall door. The sound echoed throughout the bathroom, each blow more loud than the one before, and I staggered back, gripping my chest as panic took me. "Ma'am." "Right." A man's voice broke through the confusion. I heard the bathroom door open and understood that a Walmart employee had come to see how I was doing. I screamed in a shaking voice, "There's a man in here." The employee's footsteps approached. "Sir," and I told him to go. The man in the women's restroom did not answer. Instead, he growled in a guttural manner once again before smashing his head against the door one last time. The impact was so strong that the metal door trembled, and the employee muttered a curse. In a matter of seconds, 2 more employees' footsteps entered the restroom, and based on their voices, they were able to pull the man away from the stall. It took all of my strength not to pass out when I heard them wrestle him out of the restroom. He screamed incoherently and thrashed like a savage animal when the police arrived. discovered a tiny bag of powder in his pocket. One of the officers said something about synthetic drugs, the kind that caused people to lose control. I didn't stay to hear more, but the memory of his head hitting the metal and his dazed expression are still vivid in my mind. Since then, I haven't returned to that Walmart. It is impossible for me to enter a Walmart without experiencing a chill of anxiety. The incessant hum of overhead announcements, the smell of cheap plastic and cardboard packaging, and the harsh fluorescent lights. Everything about it reminds me of the day that everything changed. I've never been able to get rid of the unsettling vibe that permeates every Walmart's aisles. As I enter, I feel as though I can still hear the stranger's footsteps resonating in my back. I was just 8 years old on that day, blissfully oblivious to the danger that may lurk in the most ordinary places. My mom, older sister, and I had trekked to the local Walmart in the years after the incident, but the recollection is still as vivid as ever. Every August, we made the trek to Crestwood, a small, peaceful town tucked away in the middle of the countryside, to prepare for the new school year. The day had begun as usual, with my mom working long hours, and after dinner, when the sun started to rise, we crammed into the old minivan to do some back-to-school shopping below the horizon. "Don't forget, we're getting you a new pair of shoes." My mother said in a patient but exhausted voice that she was the type of person who could balance work and home and still make us feel loved. I was thrilled. After I'd behaved myself at dinner, she finally gave in to my persistent pleas for a new pair of sneakers, promising that I could wear them straight out of the store. I can still remember the thrill as we passed the aisles filled with vibrant shoes, my tiny feet dancing from one display to another, and I finally got my new pair. Shoes, a bright pair of neon sneakers that I was eager to wear. As we went through the store, I felt proud of my new shoes and saw that one of my laces had come loose. My sister was talking about school supplies ahead of us. Felt like such a minor issue, a loose lace. But I cried out to my mother anyhow, and she weighed my shoes and loosened them. I claimed that neither she nor my sister heard me, as they were absorbed in discussion and swerved around the aisles, totally oblivious. To my abrupt distance from them, my heart skipped a beat as I paused to tie my shoe, feeling a bit annoyed but too happy to let it ruin my day. I knelt down and concentrated on the knot, but when I looked up again, they were gone. I peered down the aisle, but nobody was there. The shoe section's familiar sight seemed strange suddenly, as if the walls had abruptly closed in on me. I yelled once more, but the sound of far-off carts and the announcements above drowned out my voice. I moved forward in anticipation of catching up, but before I could turn around, I sensed someone behind me. A hand firmly and unforgivingly seized my shoulder. It was so cold and hard that I was immobile and my body became rigid. The brim of a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes cast a shadow over his face as I twisted my head to look up, panicking. He was tall and gray, sagging hoodie. Around his body loosely, his jawline was hidden by a disheveled beard, and the eerie, unnerving smile on his face was not one of benevolence. Rather, it was one of calmness, so peaceful that I felt my breath catch in my throat, knowing that something was amiss. Before I could scream, he dragged me backward. This wasn't someone I knew, an uncle, a family acquaintance, or anyone I had ever seen before. It also wasn't a joke. I kicked and struck my tiny fists, and they lifted me off the ground as if I weighed nothing. Weakly landing against his chest, I let out loud, frantic screams for assistance, but the man's hold didn't relax and he didn't flinch. Instead, he turned to face the exit and continued to walk steadily as if nothing unusual was occurring. "I apologize. He's a little picky today." As if he were speaking to a kid having a tantrum rather than an 8-year-old who was being hauled away against their will. The man's remarks were so informal and comforting that I looked about in the hopes that someone would notice. His voice was oddly calm, merely tired and hungry. What was going on? But the store was packed with people going about as if nothing were wrong, ignoring it and carrying on with their shopping as though everything were normal. Not a single person paused to inquire about what was occurring, and my heart raced. I felt a wave of panic. Was this really happening? The closer we got to the exit, the more hopeless I felt, the weaker I became, and the slower my kicks became. I kept struggling to scream again, but my voice was weak. It felt like everything around me was getting quieter, the store's loud noise fading, as if I were in some strange, isolated bubble. Desperate, when I looked over my shoulder and saw a mother and father with two small children walking by, something inside of me exploded. I opened my mouth and screamed one more time in desperation. "Help me, please!" For a brief moment, as if time had frozen, and the mother's eyes were fixed on mine, as well as her face. She said sharply, twisted in uncertainty, "What's going on? Here?" The man appeared to hesitate, then his hold relaxed just enough to allow me to escape. Without wasting any time, I rushed directly to the family's house. With my heart racing, the father moved to protect me from the stranger right away. The man who had been holding me turned, but before he could respond, the father was already pursuing him since the man was moving quickly. The father kept up, but not quickly enough, as he disappeared into the mob. But by the moment he arrived at the door beyond the doors, the stranger had vanished into the night. The family led me to the front of the store where my mother was, standing with a terrified mask on her face. When she saw me, her face broke, and she rushed to me. With my arms out wide, I fell into her embrace and started crying. I told her everything about the man and how he attempted to abduct me, tears streaming down my cheeks. Soon after they got my statement, the police showed there, but it was obvious they couldn't do much because the man had disappeared without a trace. As far as I'm aware, nothing ever came of it. The next few days were a haze. My mom had also changed. She stopped letting me go anywhere by herself and became more protective, watching over me in a way I hadn't seen before. I could hardly eat, and my sleep was disturbed by nightmares. The worst part was the persistent feeling that something was still out there, which I started to feel every time we went out and couldn't get rid of. The fear in her eyes when she looked at me was something I had never seen before, and it scared me even more than the stranger. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man crouching in the shadows whenever we entered a busy store. His face and that eerie smile tormented me. Growing older taught me to suppress that fear, but it was always there. Every time I entered a Walmart, that tight, stifling feeling would resurface, boiling beneath the surface as though the memories of that night were alive and ready to drag me back. Even though I'm an adult now and no longer live in Crestwood, I still get scared every time I enter a Walmart and look over my shoulder. I'm not sure if it's because I never found the closure I needed, or because the incident left a scar that will never go away. But occasionally I think about the stranger and the man. What if the family hadn't stepped in? Would I still be here today? Would they have discovered me? Have vanished? One more youngster vanished in a sea of anonymous faces I don't know, and perhaps I never will. But whenever I enter a Walmart, I can feel the echo of that man's footsteps and the weight of the shadows. The persistent, eerie reminder that even the most commonplace locations might pose a threat. It was a normal late afternoon shift at Walmart, the kind I always dreaded. The air smelled slightly of stale popcorn and cleaning supplies, and fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Wasn't feeling really well. Pregnancy hormones didn't exactly make it easier to handle the irritable, exhausted customers, but I was getting by because my due date was quickly approaching, and I just needed a few more shifts to push my cart through the aisles until maternity leave. Trying to ignore the dull aches in my lower back, I walked past the rows of shelves toward the baby section to pick up a few things I had forgotten the last time I was there. It was crowded, but nothing unusual, just another busy day. But as I passed I noticed a man standing by the DVD area with stiff, rigid posture. He was staring at a heavy, black object in his hands, which didn't seem natural because most people wouldn't act that way unless something was wrong. I dismissed it and tried not to let it stop me from moving down the aisle. Gazed too much. I didn't want to get involved, but then I felt like I was being watched, and I couldn't get the feeling to stop. I turned to look over my shoulder and saw the man staring at me with calculating, cold eyes. Something wasn't right with the race. In the hopes that he wouldn't follow me, I swiftly turned and pushed my cart closer to the baby area. However, the sensation of being watched grew stronger, and I couldn't stop thinking about his icy eyes. It seemed as though the air had suddenly become thicker, and with every stride I felt slower, as if I were walking through molasses. I arrived at the baby aisle, my breath catching as I tried to tell myself that I was just being overly cautious. I picked up some diapers and wipes, my hands shaking a little as I loaded the cart, and as I turned to leave, a loud bang reverberated throughout the store. The heart stopped beating. I froze, finding it difficult to comprehend what had just transpired. I heard shouts and the distinct sound of glass breaking again, and I was frozen in place as my hands clutched the edge of the cart, began sprinting, pushing by me in a frantic rush. As I glanced down the aisle, I saw people scurrying for cover and ducking, and the sounds of boots and shouts were interspersed with the quick bursts of gunfire. When I realized there was a gunman in the store, my chest constricted. I looked down at I had to protect my baby's stomach and go, so I pushed the cart forward as quickly as I could, but my mind was constantly racing with questions about the gunman's proximity and potential attack. I turned the corner, but before I could go any more, I heard a voice saying, "Hey." I agreed, my heart thumping in my ears, and we began running together, but the store felt like a maze, and at every turn I was afraid we might run into the gunman. It was a woman's panicked voice, and she was holding her child and gazing over her shoulder with big eyes of fear. As I arrived at the exit doors, I noticed the security guy barking commands with his hand on his radio. I rushed outside, panting for air, pushing past the terrified patrons. The chilly night seemed like a punch in the face, but I didn't care, since I knew I was safe. That this was only the start. The parking lot, which is typically crowded with cars and people going about their daily lives, was oddly quiet as I staggered out of the store. A few distant sirens screamed in the distance, but everything felt like a distant echo, as if the world had been suddenly frozen in time. Tried to remain steady as I stood there. I couldn't believe what had just happened. It didn't make sense. I looked at the other customers who had left the store with me. The majority were pacing uneasily and some were crying. My breath was gripping my gut like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. Others urgently spoke to loved ones on their AE phones. I needed to hear my fiancé Mark's voice, so I dialed his number as my hands trembled, waiting tensely for the line to ring up. He worked late shifts at the hospital and rarely answered his phone right away. Came through drowsy. "Mark, this is me. There was a shooting at Walmart and everyone is freaking out. I'm outdoors, but I can't remain here since it's unsafe." I gasped, and my voice trembled. "Are not moving. I am en route." Mark's voice abruptly became serious as he said, "Are you okay? Is the baby okay?" "I'm fine." My chest constricted as I responded, "I'm fine, but I need to get out of here." Surveyed the parking lot once more. The man in the electronics aisle kept staring at me, as if he had been waiting for something and I couldn't get the image out of my head. I wondered if this was more than a random attack. "And I'm coming now." Mark stated before hanging up. I stayed. On the line, pacing in, I kept going around trying to stay calm, but the night seemed to go on forever. The minutes felt like hours, and I kept thinking about what I had seen of the gunman, the look in his eyes, and what he wanted. Was he crazy, or was there more going on here? As I was deep in thought, I noticed a car pull up, and my heart skipped a beat, but it wasn't Mark. A man with dark, disheveled hair, wearing a sweatshirt and crazy eyes came out, glancing around with his hands in his pockets. He gave me a fleeting glance before turning away, but something about his manner unnerved me. He moved. Something about him felt off, so I turned on my heel and started walking toward the back of the parking lot, my hand still gripping my stomach, not in a hurry but with purpose, toward the store's entrance. I had to leave the store and anyone else who might be involved, and as the sound of his footsteps faded, I followed my gut, advised me to keep going. I paused when a huge bang sounded from the direction of the store, and then I heard additional shots, but these didn't sound like the frantic explosions I had heard inside the store. Instead, they were methodical and precise, as if someone was aiming for something or someone. Before I could comprehend what was happening, another gun went out, reverberating in the calm night air. My pulse raced, and I knew that this wasn't done. I turned to face the storefront and saw the man in the hoodie standing by the doors, holding something in his hand. He raised it slowly. My feet went more quickly now, motivated by an instinctive terror I couldn't resist. I wasn't sure whether the shots were directed at me, but they may as well have been. I needed to leave, so I didn't wait to see if Mark had come. My blood ran cold when I heard a car's engine roar to life as I approached the parking lot's edge. A black SUV raced toward me, its tires screeching, and my eyes latched on the front glass. The man in the hoodie was sitting in the passenger seat. The SUV came to a stop just next to me, and as the window rolled down, a man with a broad, crooked smile peered out. He appeared younger than I had anticipated, possibly in his late 20s, and his eyes glowed with a startling mixture of humor and menace that you wouldn't expect to escape. You achieved that with ease. With a tone that was both dangerous and sarcastic, he yelled out, "Lady, you're holding something far more significant than just your life." As my kid seemed to know the danger before I did, I stopped, trying to make sense of what he was saying, my heart thumping in my chest and my stomach tightening. Could respond. The man behind the wheel pushed the accelerator pedal, and the automobile sped ahead, almost avoiding me. I couldn't believe what had occurred as my legs gave way and I fell to the ground, the world spinning. I reached for my phone when I heard Mark's anxious voice on the other end of it buzzing in my pocket. He asked in a panicky voice, "Are you okay?" "I'm here. Where are you?" "I'm all right," I gasped, and I struggled to get up. But then I noticed a man in the parking lot. I looked around again and the SUV had vanished. "I managed to get to the car now," Mark stated firmly as he pulled up. "I'm not abandoning you there." I stood trembling, my hands still on my stomach, and every part of me cried out to escape. But the reality was that I was already a part of something far more significant than I could have ever dreamed. Those men weren't just any shooters. They had been anticipating me and had made it apparent that I was their target. My mind was racing. The events of the night were getting out of control, and I felt as like I was stuck in a nightmare. So I hurried to the car as fast as my pregnant body would allow. Even now, Mark's voice cracked over the phone, but I was unable to concentrate. Getting into the automobile and leaving the turmoil was the only thing that mattered. The moment I saw Mark's headlights break the darkness, a rush of relief surged over me. Throwing open the door, I rushed to the passenger side. I slammed the door behind me, breathless, and there were gunshots. "Get in," he said, his eyes wild with worry. "Are you okay?" Someone started firing inside the store, and then this guy, I'm not sure who he was chasing me. Mark hit the throttle and the car sped off. The parking area. The streets were oddly silent, so I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see the black SUV charging after us. Who were they? "Did you see their faces?" Mark inquired, looking at me. "What do they want from you?" I shook my head, fear causing the stomach to twist, I'm not sure. But they were waiting for me and claimed I was carrying something expensive, so it's not just a random shooting. Mark's expression tightened his hold on the steering wheel, which is crazy, and then my phone started ringing. I hesitated, staring at the screen as the device vibrated fiercely in my hand. It was an unfamiliar number, but something told me I had to pick it up. "Hello," I answered tentatively, and after a lengthy silence, the person on the other end spoke in a low, ominous voice. A man said. The line went silent and my fingers trembled as I lowered the phone. "You thought you were safe, didn't you?" "You're not safe, lady, and you won't be until we get what we want," I muttered, my mind racing. There are still people out there. The pressure of their comments on me, I don't know. My voice sounded hollow, but they're after me, my baby, and anything else they believe I'm carrying. Mark gave me a quick glance. Who was that? What did they mean? Mark clenched his jaw and looked around. "The route we must take to reach the police. This is becoming unmanageable." I nodded, but a part of me knew that it wouldn't matter who these people were because they were involved in something more serious and dangerous, and I wasn't sure we could escape it. We drove in silence for what seemed like hours on end, headed. As we got closer to the intersection near the closest police station, I noticed the black SUV parked at the corner, its headlights off, waiting in the dark. My heart slammed against my chest as Mark's attention shifted to the rearview mirror. They were following us, were stranded and had nowhere to flee. Mark tried desperately to lose them by making a sudden turn and rushing down a side street, but the SUV was unrelenting and kept right on our tail, its engine roaring louder as it closed the gap. I experienced a spike in adrenaline because I was so terrified, but the flight of the fight ORF. When instinct took over, I looked at Mark and said, "We need to lose them." He nodded silently and quickly spun the car onto a narrow back road, thinking the curves would give us the advantage. The SUV trailed behind, but it was unable to follow the winding path. For a few terrifying minutes, it looked like we might just escape as Mark floored the pedal, but just as I thought we were safe, the SUV rounded the bend and blocked the road. I gasped and clutched the seat in fear as Mark slammed the brakes and turned on the SUV's headlights, swamped the car, briefly blinding us. When a man in a black hoodie emerged from the car with a gun in his hand and pointed it at us while his finger tightened on the trigger, I thought we were done for. As I watched the gun in his hand, my pulse raced in my chest. I was having trouble breathing. The man said, "Get out of the car," in a hard, steady voice. "You're not going anywhere or in until you give us what we want." Mark's expression. "You must kill me first," the man, "because you want my fiancé and my child," grinned. His finger was darkly approaching the trigger when the siren sounded, and the man paused, his eyes flying back and forth as the cops came. The SUV doors flew open, and numerous. The man hesitated, then raised his weapon and dropped it. As officers with rifles drawn hurried toward the automobile, the man's grip tightened when one of the officers' voices broke the tension. But before he could squeeze the trigger, a shot boomed out from behind him, causing him to drop to the ground and the gun to clatter away as it slid across the gravel. As they closed in on him, the officer yelled, "Stay down!" With my body slumping against the seat, I let out a trembling sigh of relief as the terror that had grabbed me moments before gradually subsided. But I knew the nightmare wasn't quite finished. Mark gave me a glance. His face was pale, but he was adamant that we were safe and all was okay. However, I couldn't get rid of the sensation that this was only the beginning. Whomever these people were, they wouldn't stop. They would come after me, after my kid, and I had no idea what else they would do to get the police what they needed. I eventually put the man in handcuffs and started questioning him, but all I could think about was what lay ahead. I wasn't simply carrying life anymore. I was carrying something greater, something they would murder for, and I didn't know how far I would have to flee to protect my child. The routine was soothing, the aisles were predictable, and the faint background hum of the fluorescent lights made working at Walmart the most peaceful portion of my day. My daily trip was a quick and simple walk, because my flat was a stone's throw away, just behind the store. I would become used to going in and out through the back entrance, which allowed me to cross the parking lot, cross a quiet street, and get home in a matter of minutes. On most nights, this straightforward routine felt like the only thing that was constant in my life. But one evening, as I was starting my shift, something I saw anything odd. With the exception of the occasional delivery vehicle, the loading dock parking area is typically empty. A dark brown van was parked next to the dumpsters, which was inappropriate because it was too close to the garbage cans and too far away from where the trucks usually parked. It wasn't unusual for people to park there when the lot filled up during peak hours, so I might have dismissed it as an employee vehicle, possibly someone taking a break or running a late shift. But for some reason, I felt sick. I couldn't figure out why, though. I dismissed the emotion. I strolled inside and clocked in, telling myself that I was simply being paranoid. I tried to concentrate on the regular customers that came and left, and the quiet beeps of the scanners filled the air. By the conclusion of my shift, I was so tired that my only thoughts were about getting home, taking a hot shower, and going to bed. The clock struck the hour, so I punched out, grabbed my bag, and headed to the back entrance. I followed my usual routine, trying not to think about the van as I walked outside. But as soon as I stepped outside, the nagging feeling returned, came back to me in the back of my mind like a whisper. The van was still parked beneath the dull glow of the parking lot lights as I looked toward the dumpsters. There was no sound in the area other than the buzz of the overhead lights. I couldn't help but look, even if I didn't want to. As I turned to continue walking, I heard an engine growling in the distance. It was a low rumble, but it was growing closer and I froze. I was thinking about the van, wondering whether I had missed it earlier or if it had been parked there all night. The van was in motion. As the van rolled near me, I gently turned my head, my body stiffening, and the headlights pierced the darkness, beaming straight into my eyes. I could feel my heart pounding and the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Was it a coincidence? Perhaps they. The van slowed and rolled closer, stopping only a few feet away from me. The spotlights were dazzling, and suddenly the side door slid open with a mechanical screech that sent shivers down my spine. We were simply passing through, heading for the exit, but no. Two figures leaped into view. They moved quickly and effectively, hidden by black ski masks, and before I could react, one of them grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the vehicle. I struggled involuntarily to get out of their hold, but it was like iron, and the second man quickly covered my mouth with a gloved hand. Anxiety swept through. I twisted and kicked as they pulled me into the open van, trying to scream, but the hand across my lips muffled the sound. The last thing I saw as the door slammed shut was Walmart's faint outline, vanishing from view as I fought against their grip inside the van. My chest thumping with my heart, I fought with everything I had, eager to break away. But the men were too strong then. Without warning, I was punched in the face with a vicious blow. My eyesight clouded, and I blinked rapidly, trying to regain focus. When I glanced up, my eyes met the cold, unyielding barrel of a revolver, the metal shining dimly in the dim light of the van. My stomach churned. I tried to talk, but I was too scared. They conversed in low, seemingly casual yet unsettling tones, paralyzed by the circumstances, as opposed to the fear that seized me. The van rocked, and although the language sounded like Portuguese, I couldn't be certain. The world appeared to spin as I attempted to make sense of what was happening as it sped away, and I slid helplessly on the floor, my thoughts racing with every turn but my body too weak from the shock to act. Occurring, but there was no way to make sense of it. I was being abducted and dragged away by two strangers wearing masks, and I had no idea why. Then, just as my mind was about to give up in despair, I noticed a sliver of optimism amid the confusion. No seat behind me. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the handle to the rear hatch in the middle of an unoccupied area. Could this be my chance? My kidnappers were still conversing, so I looked back to make sure they were distracted. I took a deep breath in the hopes that they wouldn't notice, and then I pulled the handle with one quick motion, causing the rear hatch to suddenly burst open with a sudden gust of cold air. Without hesitation, I threw the handle, my hands shaking as I reached for it, my fingers closing around it, cold and slick with sweat. The wind whipped through my hair as I stepped out of the van, and the tarmac raced up to greet me. As I struck the ground, my body exploded with pain, but I didn't stop. With adrenaline rushing through my veins, I scurried to my feet and had to move more quickly behind me. I heard the van screech to a stop and the doors banged open. The sound of footsteps hitting the sidewalk reverberated throughout the night, indicating that they were pursuing me. I forced myself to run faster than I had ever run before, ignoring the burning in my legs and the searing pain in my lungs. My only concern was making sure Walmart was safe, and even though I could hardly see the lights up ahead, I knew how to do it. Had previously, but when I got to the back entrance, I rushed through the door and slammed it shut behind me. I collapsed against the cold metal, gasping for air and my entire body trembling as the fear of what had just happened finally hit me. I called 911 with my hands. When the operator answered, I was so shaken that I could hardly hold the phone. As I described what had happened, the police came swiftly, took statements, and searched the area, but the van and the men were long gone, and they suspected the men were involved in a bigger operation. In the days that followed, I couldn't get rid of the pictures of that night, the vehicle, the masked faces, and the pistol. Every time I went outside, I felt as though I was part of something much more sinister than I had ever imagined, possibly connected to human trafficking. It took weeks before I could return to Walmart without my heart pounding and without constantly checking over my shoulder. But I knew I would never forget the terror of that night, the fear, and the helplessness. I was fortunate to be alive, but the nightmare never really ended, and I will never be the same. The parking lot, which had once felt so familiar and comforting, now felt like a trap, so I avoided it at all costs. I returned to Walmart a few months after that terrifying van incident, but this time I was there to pick up some groceries and hair dye, so I could unwind and treat myself over the weekend. I parked my car in the center of the lot under the familiar, dim streetlight, and as I stepped out, I felt a strange chill. However, I was understandably anxious after my encounter months earlier. But I reminded myself that this was just a typical shopping trip. The supermarket was empty, with only a few people browsing the aisles, and I pushed my cart while gathering milk bread and a few other necessities. The serene ambiance lured me into a false sense of security because, after all, it was Walmart, where I had worked and visited innumerable times. It felt secure in its familiarity, but as I was about to pay, I remembered that I had forgotten my handbag in the aisle. I turned to the cashier, a young woman with a nice face, and asked if I could leave my cart at the front while I hurried outside to get it. "No problem," she answered with a grin. "Thank you," I said, trying to shake my head. "Car," I muttered to myself, furious at myself. The parking lot felt different, almost eerie under the streetlights, as I hurried toward the entrance to get rid of the strange unease that seemed to settle in my chest. I noticed the rows of cars that seemed to disappear into the shadows and the vast emptiness that stretched around me. It was odd how quiet the lot seems to have been deserted. I moved quickly toward my car, trying to concentrate, but I was distracted when I noticed a slip of paper tucked beneath my windshield wiper. I paused, perplexed, and looked about, but there was only the faint buzz of far-off traffic and no one in the area. My heart skipped a beat when I leaned forward to look at the paper and saw the words "turnaround" written in sloppy, jagged handwriting. "What the hell?" I murmured to myself. I looked over my shoulder as I felt a sharp shudder go up my spine. But the lot was deserted. It must have been a terrible joke or some kind of hoax. I unlocked the door to my room and stuffed the note into my pocket in an attempt to get rid of the dread that was eating at me. Automobile, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as though someone was observing me. My body began to tighten gradually, so I turned to look out the window and noticed a tall, broad-shouldered man moving swiftly toward my car from the shadows. His dark bandana partially obscured his face, but his eyes were unmistakably intense and dark, and they were fixed on me. My heart rate increased. I felt a wave of panic. He was too close, too quickly, and I momentarily froze, my body trapped in some primal fight-or-flight response. With my hand shaking as I struggled to get my keys, I thought I had yanked the door shut and pressed the lock button. The man arrived at my window and, with terrifying speed, started pulling on the handle in an attempt to force it open. His face was inches away, his eyes dark and unrelenting, and as he pressed his face to the glass, his fist thudded against the window, and I could hear He grumbled and fogged up the window as he shouted something I couldn't make out. Letting me in. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest almost too loudly, and the noise was unrelenting, slamming repeatedly. I was caught in this car I searched for my keys, feeling my skin get cold with fear, and whispered to myself, "Come on, come on," until my hands found the ignition. I shoved the key in and turned on the engine, feeling the engine vibrations of the vehicle. The car surged forward as soon as it started, and I put my foot down on the gas pedal without turning around. However, the man wasn't finished. I saw him in the side mirror, still coming with his eyes fixed on mine. I heard him curse loudly as I slammed the gas harder in a frantic attempt to escape, and then there was a terrible snap and a sharp sound as he swung something against the window, a rock or possibly metal, but it didn't stop me in the split. It took a moment to swing it in the direction of the glass. My foot slammed down on the accelerator as I put the car in drive. The car jolted forward, and I felt his hand being torn from the door handle for a brief moment, before the glass erupted inward. Splintering the seat and dashboard, I yelled, swerving slightly as the force of the contact sent waves of panic through me, and my ears rang with the terrible sound of it. Cold air poured in. When I put more pressure on the gas, the automobile sped out of the parking lot. I looked in the side mirror and noticed the shadowy figure of he was rushing after me, but I was unable to turn around, so I forced myself to move more quickly. My heart pounding in my chest, and eventually made it home with my hands still shaking and my breath coming in short gasps. I parked in the driveway before realizing what had happened, that I still had the note in my hand, and as I unfolded the crumpled paper and stared at those two words once more, my hand trembled. I turned around, and a chill went down my spine that was colder than the night air. The note had been more than just a warning. It had been a purposeful lure. Trapped to get me to exit my vehicle and expose me to danger, I hurried inside, inspecting every window and door, slamming the door behind me and securing it. The silence in my house felt almost oppressive as I stood in the center of the living room. I had to report what had happened when I got back to Walmart the next morning with my husband. But more than anything, I needed to know that I wasn't alone, since every time I walked into that parking lot, I saw flashes of the man's eyes. The manager listened to my story, while his eyes widened with the sound of the glass breaking and the echo of his fist hitting my window. Weeks later, I still couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched every time I passed that lot. A tiny part of me tensed up. Shock. We'll look into the footage, he promised, and we'll make sure our staff stays vigilant so this won't happen again. However, there was only so much solace in his words. Couldn't help but look over my shoulder or take a closer look at my surroundings, and the thought of that innocuous-looking note on a piece of paper kept me awake at night, wondering how many other people might have fallen for the same trick. From that day on, I knew for sure that I would never again disregard my instincts. When I first saw Mark, I had been working at Walmart for a few months. He wasn't the kind to fit in. Rather, he stood out in a way that unnerved you without completely explaining why he was silent, perhaps even a bit odd. I initially dismissed it since some people are just strange, but it wasn't until a week later that he began asking if I needed a ride home that I realized that Mark always seemed to be hovering just on the periphery of every conversation, his eyes never quite meeting yours but always watching, always waiting. He would ask every shift, his voice almost too calm, his offer too eager, and I would always say no, but it didn't stop him from asking repeatedly, "It's no trouble," as if he needed a lift. I felt a tiny knot of unease twist in my gut. Were some sort of pattern he was unable to break, and I assumed I was being overly suspicious. It wasn't like he had ever done anything inappropriate. He never put pressure on me or pushed too hard, but the way he always lingered too long and the look in his eyes had begun to irritate me. One evening, my car broke down. My normal ride couldn't make it, so I had no choice but to beg for aid because I didn't know what to do. Naturally, Mark was there because fate had a twisted sense of humor, and we lived close to each other. Said, grinning broadly. He drove a beat-up old Honda that looked like it had seen better days 10 years ago. I should have said no when I hesitated, but I didn't since I was exhausted and needed to go home. "Thank you," I responded with a grin. "I'll even buy you supper as a reward." I tried not to think about it, telling myself it was only a car, but when I got inside, I saw something odd. The passenger door had no handle. Why was it missing, I had already asked. It had scrapes like it had been in a lot of accidents. Sensing that something wasn't right, Mark shrugged and quickly looked away as if he didn't want to look at me. I forced a laugh to ignore the mounting discomfort that was eating at me. As we pulled out of the lot, I saw that Mark's hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. I tried to ignore the cold chill that was creeping up my spine by rolling the window up. This was nothing, I told myself. It was just a ride. Just a guy trying to be nice. Nothing more. The car jerked as he changed course. The tension in the car increased as I tried to strike up a conversation with him, telling him about the cafe down the street where I was going to buy him supper. But he didn't answer or even recognize me. It was as though I wasn't there at all. The stillness was oppressive, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Then, out of the blue, he swerved the car just enough to the right to make my heart leap into my throat. "Everything, okay?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Yeah, fine," he replied, his eyes never leaving the road. However, there was a chilly tone in his voice that made me shudder. I looked at the door handle once again, and its absence felt more like a trap than a simple peculiarity. My senses were telling me to leave, but I told myself that I was being unreasonable, and that why not fix that door, I inquired, attempting to speak in a pleasant tone. Mark's face tensed, his jaw clenched, and he gave me a darker look behind his eyes for the first time instead of his typical bored gaze. 3 years, he murmured in a quiet voice. Years I've been waiting for this, but I had no idea what he meant, and for a few seconds, my stomach turned to knots as I attempted to determine whether he was kidding or had gone absolutely insane. After 3 years, I forced myself to say, "What are you talking about?" And for the first time, his eyes met mine. His mouth formed a twisted, unnerving smile. After 3 years of waiting, the words lingered in the air, and I was having trouble breathing. I knew I had to leave quickly, so I moved my body without thinking. I reached for the window crank once again, pretending to adjust my seat, hoping to bring it down far enough to scream if necessary. But before I could do so, I felt a stinging pain stab me in the side. I looked down and my heart stopped. He was holding a taser. My ribs were forced up against the spikes. As he squeezed it harder, I froze, too astonished to respond, and the shock of pain sent a shockwave through my body, causing my muscles to lock up and my eyesight to blur. It was then that I realized I must move quickly, or this ride will be my last. He muttered something to himself that I couldn't understand as I sagged back into the seat and pretended to fall limp. I could feel his gaze on me and knew he was looking to see whether I would remain down. All I could think of was how I felt. I acted as though I was going to escape this automobile alive. But when his focus returned to the road, I jerked the steering wheel to the left, causing the car to swerve and slam into the guardrail with a loud crash. Mark yelled and briefly lost his hold on the wheel, but I didn't, wasting a moment. My heart thumping in my chest, I pushed myself out of the car and staggered onto the dark road. In the distance, headlights appeared and I waved frantically in, the hopes that they would stop the first car that sped past, but the door was still locked. Mine, however, had finally given way and scrambled over him, kicking him away in my panic. Seconds slowed, the window rolled down, and I collapsed in relief, trembling and breathless as I exploded everything. Later that night, the police discovered Mark at his apartment, where his walls were covered in unsettling photos of me and other people he worked with. There was also a picture of me in one corner, torn and faded, as if I still feel as though he's out there somewhere, and my heart skips a beat whenever I see a car with a missing door handle, because he had been waiting for this moment for far too long. The timepiece. It was getting close to midnight on a typical Friday night shift at the Walmart in suburban Atlanta. You knew it would go on forever with nothing to occupy you. This night felt strange from the beginning. The air was thick and heavy, and something about the way the fluorescent lights buzzed above me felt off. I was just another cashier, clocking in my hours, praying that nothing crazy would happen. The store had that eerie silence of its own. When he first entered, he didn't seem like much, a scruffy, bearded man in his mid-40s wearing a jacket, but something about the way he moved and his eyes darted around as if he was always on edge put me on high alert. His every step echoed too loudly and sharply. The aisles. He passed my register a few times, seeming to be shopping, but I could see him. He never stayed on one thing for very long. He was always calculating. Evidently there was something there as they moved near the back corner and looked at the security cameras. Predatory in his movements, he was simply waiting for the ideal opportunity and wasn't searching for anything in particular. I tried to ignore the uneasy sensation, but my intuition told me that this wasn't going to be another quiet evening. I kept an eye on him for a few more minutes, mentally noting where he was, and he was still hiding close to the electronics. But now a second man had joined him. He was younger, perhaps in his 30s, and had a hoodie on that hid his face. They nodded quickly before turning to go in front of me, but I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling that I was going to be caught in the middle of something I didn't want. Any area, and then the first man, the unkempt one, approached my register. He had only a cheap watch, a pack of gum, and a bottle of water, but his body language was completely off. He was standing too close to his scanning of the eyes. As I rang up his purchases, I inquired, trying to sound casual, and he murmured, not looking at me, just glancing at the door as if he was expecting someone who would be there. The store behind me was always moving, so I forced myself to remain cool and keep my face neutral. $7.93, I remarked, putting the total across the CC, and he gave me a crumpled $10 bill with trembling hands. I looked down at the cash then. He spoke almost too quickly, and before I could reply, he gathered his belongings and hurried toward the door. Back up at him, his eyes met mine for the first time, and there was something icy and sinister about them. I tried to calm myself by taking a long breath, but then I heard something heavy and metallic clinking as it hit the floor right outside the door. I knew right once that the man had dropped something. And it wasn't just a pack of gum or a bottle of water. It was a pistol. My heart raced when I heard the cold metal clink echoing in my brain. But before I could respond, the door opened again. And this time the unkempt man wasn't by himself. Two men with weapons drawn and masks followed him in. The room's temperature decreased. My blood raced cold as one of the masked guys cried, "Don't move," in a muffled voice. My instincts urged me to escape, but my feet wouldn't move, so they herded the few surviving customers to the back of the store. I felt the hairs on my neck spring up. They were compelled by the store to move away from the security cameras into the stockroom. I made an effort to remain composed so that I could think properly, but something told me that this was not your typical heist. They weren't there for food or money, but rather for something worse. The second man, the one who hadn't though, his eyes were obscured by the mask. He spoke and approached me carefully, making it impossible to mistake the threat. He told me to go to the back in his posture, and I agreed while trying to maintain a steady breathing pattern. His voice was low and menacing, way toward the staff area, but before I could go into the hallway, I heard a client scream from a distance, followed by the sound of rushed footsteps. The men were moving swiftly. I could hear heavy machinery rattling as they put up something, but I had no idea what it was. It seemed like they were getting ready for an event. Equipment, the sound of something being pulled across the floor with a metallic clink. A few employees were hiding in the stockroom, so I hurried to the rear entrance. I trembled as I whispered, but it was too late because the door behind me and the men in masks crashed open, stormed in, saying, "Oh, stay down." One of them yelled, grabbing a nearby customer and dragging him roughly to the ground. "Where is it?" I didn't know what he was talking about, and I didn't care to find out. The only thing I could think of was leaving. They hadn't come for money, they'd come for something much darker. The final transaction had been completed, and whatever had transpired in the back was far beyond my control. A voice from the back called out, "They've got it, they found it," and the masked men turned toward the sound. I didn't have time to turn around or wonder what they had discovered, so I just ran for the exit. I barely made it out of anything I wanted to be a part of. An hour later, the police arrived, but by then, the men had left and the store was in ruins with only confusion and unanswered questions. The news reports later claimed it was a botched robbery, but I knew better, knowing what they had been pursuing. Wasn't money. It was something much worse. And I knew that night would change me forever because whatever they took, whatever they were searching for, wasn't simply a robbery. It was a deal, a last transaction that would follow me for the rest of my life. As I dragged my weary feet across the aisles, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. It was 11:30 p.m., and I was working Walmart's graveyard shift, replenishing cleaning materials. After more than 3 months of employment, I was beginning to feel the effects of the late hours. The store was disturbingly quiet, almost too quiet, with only a few sporadic customers wandering around, almost perceptible in the vast aisles that are empty. "Hello, Mark." My coworker waved from the break room door, looking as though he hadn't slept well in weeks. I phoned in hopes of getting a quick distraction, but I continued to fight through the night's fatigue. Was dragging, and I wanted to leave without anything odd happening. But then it began. I saw an elderly woman standing in front of the cleaning aisle, simply looking at the shelves. I had seen her before, usually in the late hours of the night, wandering the aisles when no one else was around. But tonight was different. She wasn't just perusing. I tried to be courteous and get her moving because I wasn't in the mood for any strange encounters, but she was standing motionless with her eyes wide and glazed over, as if she was looking for something, or perhaps lost in a memory. Her head suddenly snapped to me, and for a moment I thought maybe she hadn't heard me. But when our eyes meet, something wasn't right. I felt like I wasn't looking at anyone anymore because her eyes weren't just blank. They were empty, as if nothing was behind them. She didn't say anything, just stood there staring, and I felt a chill go through me. "Okay," I muttered, taking a hesitant step back to hide my discomfort. But the eye heard the distinct sound of shuffling footsteps as soon as I turned, and when I looked over my shoulder, she was gone. 1 second, she was standing there, and the next she was gone. I rubbed my eyes, thinking that maybe I was just seeing things, but I felt deep down that something wasn't quite right. Alongside me, I tried to concentrate on my work, but the store felt off. The silence seemed to be getting heavier, like the walls were closing in. I looked at my phone, which showed that it was 1 a.m. Mark was leaning against the stop-lock room door when I turned the bend of the aisle. "You saw her, didn't you?" he questioned. "Speak with a low voice." I froze, looking at him, wondering who the elderly woman was. Mark kept looking around as if he was worried someone may find out that she has been coming in for months, but she is more than just a customer. When she is there, other people disappear. Workers, clients. His voice faded to a near whisper. "They don't leave. They just disappear. You must believe me when I say that this isn't just her. There's something sinister here." I half doubted him. But as I walked back into the aisles, the vibe of the store began to change. His face had gone pale, and the terror in his eyes made me doubt myself. "No way, dude, this is just a store. Nothing is wrong. Folks are just strange." As I passed the home goods section, I noticed her reflection in the mirror. She was staring at herself, her eyes nearly wide, and lights flickered and odd noises and footsteps that weren't mine echoed around the empty aisles. The silence felt like it was closing in on me at that moment. Panicked, but there was a problem. I blinked twice, but when I turned to look behind me, she had vanished once more. Her face was twisted in panic, and her hands were pressed against the glass as though she were attempting to escape something. I felt so terrified that I couldn't stop ignoring it. I needed to find Mark again, but I couldn't make sense of it. My pulse was pounding and my mind was confused. He was pacing uneasily in the stock area when I spotted her. I shouted out her reflection, but it wasn't her. "Something is wrong with it." Mark didn't seem shocked. He simply nodded slowly. I told him that it wasn't just her. There was something else about this store that was black. People don't leave. They simply vanish. He hesitated, and when you see that, you can't stop a feeling of fear swept over me. I kept thinking about it even though I needed to leave. For the next hour, I tried to ignore the sensation that something was drawing me in. I had to know more. But I heard whispers in the aisles and felt like I was being watched when I turned a corner, but it was 3 a.m. and nobody was there. When I saw her standing outside the front doors once more, I paused, my breath caught in my mouth. Her eyes were different this time, desperate and frantic, as if she was attempting to flee something, but she was unable to do so. I cautiously went outside. She didn't flinch or react as I pushed the door open just a crack. Instead, she just stared back at me, her eyes filled with something sinister that chilled my blood. Then, without saying anything, she turned and started to go, but she wasn't going into the night. Was heading toward the parking lot when she continued to walk until she vanished into the earth. I stood there speechless and immobile, wondering what the heck had happened, but that wasn't the worst part. I was about to get back inside when my phone buzzed in my pocket, alerting me to Mark's warning not to look too intently at the ground as it will drag you under like the others. As I gazed down to the pavement below, my heart skipped a beat. The ground rippled as if the earth had engulfed her, and I heard footsteps. Behind me, I felt like I was being watched, and I couldn't get rid of the thought that she had actually left or was still locked here. I turned my stomach and fell to my feet, but no one was there, so I fled back inside. I never worked the graveyard shift again, but every time I passed that Walmart, I couldn't help but look at the parking lot, and occasionally I believe I still see her there watching. What was she waiting for? 7 months pregnant, I had been working the night shift at Walmart for more than a year in an attempt to save money for the baby and get through this phase of my life. I was exhausted, my back hurt, and my feet felt like lead. The sound of the door should have been reassuring, but tonight it felt unsettling. Nina scanned goods behind the register for the few weary customers who didn't appear to notice me, particularly in this enormous store that seemed like a cavern of emptiness. After midnight, with the overhead lights flickering, I detested working late. Extended shadows that appeared to go on forever, and I kept thinking that I wasn't alone until I noticed him, a man in his early 30s, moving slowly around the aisles while wearing dark clothing and a hood drawn low over his face. At first, I didn't give it much thought, but something about him felt off, and my eyes kept returning to him. It seemed like he was waiting for something, and every time he was staring at me, the store was nearly empty. Now there weren't many people wandering the aisles. I tried to concentrate on my work, but every time I looked up, his eyes were coldly calculating, as if he were weighing something. I couldn't take my eyes off of him, and then he abruptly vanished down one of the aisles. A wave of mild comfort passed over me, but it was short-lived because a sensation of dread sank in my stomach like a stone heavier than my bloated belly. My mind raced, and I had to concentrate to ignore it. But I knew that this wasn't the end, so I chose to look for supplies in the back room in the hopes that the routine will help me stay grounded. As I made my way down the small aisles, the flickering lights made the store feel even more gloomy, so I grabbed a flashlight. The stillness was oppressive, as if the store itself were holding its breath, and every floorboard felt louder than usual. Before I could scream, I felt a tap on my shoulder, swung around, and felt him jump into my throat. He told me to keep quiet, using a low, gring voice that sounded like it belonged to someone who had long since forgotten how to speak politely. Beside him, a larger figure emerged. He took hold of my wrist and dragged me toward the rear of the store, his ruthless grin extending unnaturally across his face. "Please don't harm me," I pleaded in a trembling voice. "Please, I'm pregnant." I can't have the larger man's eyes softened for just a moment. A moment, but then he gave me a more forceful shove. The panic struck me hard. I was helpless and alone, and they had firearms. My pregnancy seemed like a shield and a vulnerability, but I had to hope that it would mean something to them. Perhaps I could find a way to buy some time, but the fact sank in that unless I came up with a quick solution, I wouldn't be able to escape this. We arrived at the staff break room, where the flickering lights seemed to dim even more, obscuring everything and adding to the tension in the air. The man pulled out a duffel bag and said, "We need you to open the back storage doors." His voice was tight and impatient, and I froze. "I don't have the keys," I whispered, barely holding my breath. "I can't open that without a manager," he added. "You work here, don't you know how to get us what we want?" Arched an eyebrow in a way that was obviously disappointed. My mind was racing because I couldn't figure out what they were pursuing or why they needed to break into a back storage area for something so vital. I stammered, "I don't have the codes, you'll need someone else to unlock it." I tried to keep them talking so they wouldn't get any closer to what they wanted. "I need a manager's authorization." He tightened his hold on my arm, nearly causing me to scream. "You think we care?" "Regarding your justifications," he spat in a disgusted voice, "you know exactly what we need." I felt my heart thumping in my chest as I opened the door. Every beat seemed like a countdown. What was going on, and who were these men at the time? Appeared to be about to shatter when the sound of glass cracking reverberated throughout the store. Then, the alarm went off without warning, and the men froze, their faces going pale. "What the hell did you do?" the larger man hissed, glancing toward the back of the store and tightening his hold on me. Became a little more relaxed, and for the first time I noticed a look of fear in his eyes. I had no idea what had happened, but it was obvious that something had gone wrong, and I wasn't waiting around to find out. My heart was racing as I rushed down the aisles, my adrenaline pumping, rushing through me as I arrived at the front of the business. I noticed blue lights flashing outside the window and heard police radios crackling. I screamed as loudly as I could, pointing to the back of the store, and an officer raced inside with a revolver drawn. I turned and sprinted for the exit without waiting to see what would happen next. I didn't care if I was heard or seen, I just needed to get out. The police's footsteps pounded in the silence, and the guys were soon encircled. The first man, the one wearing the hoodie, began to back toward the exit. However, it was too late. They were cornered. The men were taken into custody, their faces twisted in shock, and I watched as they were escorted from the business. "You think this is over?" the man in the hoodie said, turning to face me with a chilly, vacant expression. This was just low and unsafe. In the beginning, I felt cold. What did he mean by saying that this wasn't simply a random robbery? These individuals had been pursuing something more significant, something I couldn't possibly fathom. The store, was in disarray with police everywhere, and as the aftermath of the break-in continued to unfold, I was rattled, but still alive. As I sat in the break room trying to calm myself, my thoughts kept returning to what the man had said and what they had been. When the authorities finally let me to go for home I knew that nothing would ever be the same, as the chilly night air touched my face outdoors. The quiet store where I'd spent so many restless nights would never be the same, and neither would I.